One of the great questions in this whole sustainability world, the sustainable business world, is just asking the question, how would nature do that? That being pretty much anything that you all do in your companies. That requires, gets to the topic of biomimicry, which is about nature-inspired design thinking and systems thinking. And here to talk about that, good friend of ours, co-founder and keystone at Biomimicry 3.8, Dayna Baumeister. Dayna, welcome.
Joel, thank you. I can't wait until we all get to go outside after this, get ourselves out of this cage that we're in, because I'd like to convince you in the next 10 minutes with this great idea that being outside is really where we're going to find the answer for just about, if not all, of the questions that we have. And we've heard a lot about biomimicry in the media, particularly when it comes to mimicking forms and processes, and we see these great product examples. But really what we face as a species and the challenges that we have are often at the system level. So I want to talk about what we can learn from the natural world when it comes to systems today. And of course, as you imagine, there's a lot to talk about, and I only have a small fraction of time to touch on it. But clearly we know that our world, as we design it as a species, is full of systems, right? Our businesses are systems, departments within a business is a system, the ecosystem of your supply chain and your stakeholders, that's all part of the system. Well, we're not the only system on the planet. In fact, the planet has been thriving with ecosystems and all sorts of systems for 3.8 billion years, a little longer than we've been here. And even within our own bodies, our cells are systems, our organs are systems, our whole body populations are systems. So at all different levels, there's quite a bit that we can learn. And I think that's really important that we begin to ask that question, because when we look at this picture, that looks like, it looks wrong, right? It looks like, what is that guy doing out there? And why do we think that that's wrong? Why do we think that that's a separate kind of thing? Shouldn't our businesses and being out there look like it's appropriate for us to be part of that ecosystem? And if indeed we actually learn to mimic systems, we could begin seeing this picture in a different light. So what I want to talk about are three really critical, non-negotiable operating conditions of all systems, no matter what scale that we're looking at, and then how we can take lessons, design principles, suggestions under each of those three categories that can help us think better about our systems. So the first I want to talk about is context is everything. It is like the non-negotiable. You cannot ignore context. And surprisingly, in our businesses all the time, we forget the role of the system in which we live, and we try to operate. That context determines all of the rules of the game. So if that's the case, how does life respond to that? Well, one of the things that's really, really important we see is that life must be locally attuned. That's the local context, not the global context, but the local context. And if you're not locally attuned to that, you will not thrive. So you take cypress, for example. There's many, many species of cypress, but they all behave very differently depending on the context in which they are. So the bald cypress, which is completely submerged for anywhere from 1 to 3 months out of the year in flooding, has to have the right kind of root structure that allows it to live in that context. Whereas a cypress that might grow here on the West Coast looks very, very different because it doesn't have to deal with those floods. Still the same species, but it's same family, but locally attuned. Or we could look at something like these narwhals, you know, the unicorns of the sea. It's often thought that those are like spears and daggers because we like thinking about war, but life doesn't look at it that way. In fact, those horns, they're actually modified teeth, the tusks that they have, allow these narwhals to stay locally attuned to the exact niche that they are. They turn out that they're like magnified antennae, and they're so sensitive to the temperature and chemical concentration of the water that they know exactly when those water paths will freeze solid, which would be bad news for an air-breathing mammal. But that's their niche, and that's where they stay. And so they have that very fine-tuned, locally attuned that allows them to thrive in that place where no other species can. Another important rule is that life uses feedback loops. If context is everything, then you better be able to interpret that context and make sense of it. These little guys here, this is a colony of slime mold. And slime mold are known as social amoeba. They actually spend most of their lives as individual amoeba until the resources are depleted. They put out a chemical signal that says, hey guys, this place sucks, we need to move on. And they come together, they collectively grow a stalk, which you see here, and a fruiting body. They assemble, or sort of like bring everything together so that they can then disperse to the next site. So using those feedback loops and cooperating, they're able to be tuned to any context in which they are. Or, of course, we have to take a local example, the saguaros. You'll see cohorts of saguaros in the landscape because they're so tuned to the rainfall that happens each year that they don't germinate new plants every year. They only germinate in just the right rainfall conditions because they know they need to time that with the availability of the precious water that they'll need to grow. And then as a cohort, they grow up, and then you see the flowering and fruiting that's closely tied in feedback loops to the pollinators and the dispersers that visit them at just those right times. All context dependent. The other thing that's an important part of context is the DNA that you have to work with, right? That's your context as well. What is your building materials? And we know that life builds with what works. So mammals, of course, are a very diverse group of species, and bats are the only real true flying mammals that are out there. Well, they've modified and worked with the DNA. So those lovely wings, those are just modified finger bones with a membrane that's stretched between them and allows them to fly. But they also have brought with them many of the DNA about being social cooperators. They actually have social feeding, and they will take care of each other. If somebody doesn't get enough blood that night, the other ones, not even related genetically, will share some of their blood meal so that as a social group and a whole colony, they can thrive. So building on those mammalian traits, they've found a special niche that allows them to live in context. Or you take jellyfish. They are the oldest multicellular organism on the planet, been around for about 505 million years compared to our 2 million at most. And the jellyfish have really figured out a whole bunch of array of strategies for building on that DNA that has allowed them to thrive in all of the contexts of the different kinds of salinities and temperatures of the ocean in which they've lived. The second big operating condition, and it's super important to recognize, we talked about abiotic conditions of context, but there's also biotic context conditions. And life always puts relationship before task. And we know as people, that's a good idea. If you build relationship with the people in your department and you have a strong relationship, your tasks will get done that much more effectively. Well, that's a good rule for systems in general. So one of the most important ways to do that is to cultivate cooperative relationships. We used to think that nature was red in tooth and claw and it was all about competition. Really what we see is the avoidance of competition and really about cultivating that cooperation. When you come to a watering hole, yes, you could develop a whole bunch of strategies around making sure you don't get eaten. Or you could sort of cooperate and say, okay, we all need this resource, and none of us want to get eaten by the lion. So let's work together and use the signals of all of us being alert to some degree, but a little bit lower degree, so that we can partake in that resource of the water and collectively watch out for the lion. We also see many examples of mutualisms, really tightly linked cooperation, where there's a win-win exchange of value. And that exchange of value is very different. In this case, you have protection for the fish, and the fish cleans the anemone, and then the anemone also gets any leftover food particles that the fish doesn't eat. But the important thing about these win-win cooperations is that they are true value exchanges. There's no such thing as money in nature, because that's a surrogate, and surrogates can easily be corrupted. And so in nature's exchanges, they're really true value for value exchange. Life also needs to leverage networks. in order to fit into context. And we know that networks are emergent characteristics, emergent properties, whether we're talking about the neurons in our brain or if we're looking at the mycelial networks that underlink all of the plants. All species, except for domesticated corn, rely on mycelia networks and exchange carbon nutrients between those networks. And those relationships allow them to thrive in an environment where nutrients or carbon might be limited. Another thing that's important for relationships is this idea of self-organizing. And self-organizing allows groups of organisms to thrive together without a top-down hierarchical directed movement. Whether it's swarms of fish that are schooling using simple rules, or whether you've got things like ant colonies or bee colonies that have a very robust way of getting their tasks met because they have the relationship between each other. The last context I want to talk about is that change happens. So I know we learned yesterday about the brick and mortar folks, the brick builders. Well, this is just a fact of life, that change happens, it always has, and it always will. And in fact, it's going to be even greater in the future. So we can either fight that and try to hold the bowl still, or we can embrace that and leverage that. And that's what we see life doing. One of the things life does is work with succession, and our systems should as well. We can't expect that overnight you're going to go from a glacier retreat in a hard rock to a mature forest. First, you need the lichen to come in and break down the minerals, and over time, those minerals become available to other species. Those species come in, they can handle the bright light, the next species can't, and they move on, and eventually you have a forest. We need to embrace that and leverage that as we begin thinking about how we can work with the change that happens. I really love that a lot of when we think about succession is that there's a linearity to it in the sense that there's a direction, but it's always a circular process. And in fact, there's 5 times as long that species give back to the habitat than they were alive. This is a redwood tree, and it will be providing resources to that system for 5 times of the length of time that it was standing upright. The last thing I wanted, or 2 more actually. So change happens, so therefore we must adapt or we die. That's super simple, and you can look at that at a species level. We've got to adapt or die. You can look at it at a business level, a department level, a product level, whatever you want, because change is there. So this is a close-up of a torch coral, and we talk about bleaching of our reefs. Well, life is figuring that out. Corals are like, this temperature increase, this isn't so good. What's happening with those bleaching is they're expelling their symbiotic partners, which are a zooxanthellae that helps photosynthesize and brings sugars into the coral. They expel those zooxanthellae, which had the color, and that's why they look white, because they're bleached. And everybody thinks that's horrible, which it is, because it means the coral could die. But then they're finding new partners that have higher temperature thresholds. Whether or not they can do it in enough time is an important feature, but that's part of that adapt or die that corals are figuring out. Or if we look at these gannets, there used to be many, many species of gannets on the planet, but then when the marine mammals started taking and growing and flourishing, they were eating a lot of the food supply. So a few species of gannets figured out a way around that. They adapted rather than died. And so they dive from 100 feet up in the air, going at speeds up to 70 miles an hour and hit the water so that they can dive down into the water anywhere from 10 to 20 feet. And so part of that adaptation is they've moved their nostrils inside their beak so they can close their mouth and not get water up their nose when they dive, right? It's a trick. And then they've got cushioned air pockets in their breast and in their head so they don't have that impact when they hit. Then the last one I want to talk about is this idea of embodying resilience. Resilience is the ability to withstand disturbance and tolerate it when we don't know where it's coming from, how big it is, or what kind of impact it's going to have. So whether you're an aspen stand and you have this resilience through growing clonally, vegetatively, having reproductive fruiting bodies, or whether or not you're a coral reef and a mangrove that's dealing with large storms and waves and managing all of that because you have decentralized, diverse, and redundant systems. Each one of these could be a huge lesson in and of itself. And what we have to realize is that we're not looking at a barren landscape and trying to figure this all out as a species all by ourselves. We're not alone. We're not the first ones who have to design thriving systems for this planet. And in fact, this guy's doing research, right, for his work to understand what a system works and how it thrives. And isn't that where we'd all rather be doing our research instead of in front of a keyboard someday? And what I'd like to leave you with is a recognition that we really are a young species, and maybe it's about time we start asking our elders for some advice on how to grow our own systems here on this planet. Thank you.